Hello and welcome to Create Context Weekly Movie Minute. We are brought to you by create-context.com. You can head over there for more movie reviews and analysis. Today we are talking about Wolfman. Leigh Whannell's newest film, Wolfman, is both a technical achievement and a narrative bore. This pseudo remake of the well-known lycanthrope legend starts off strong before diving into too many metaphors and realizing none of them. His 2020 film, The Invisible Man, felt like a breath of fresh air for the monster movie genre, but Wolfman unfortunately didn't learn the correct lessons from his previous film. Wolfman is not a bad movie. There are actually parts and aspects of this film that are quite good, but each plot thread is half heartedly set up with no satisfying conclusion. What begins as an interesting metaphor for parents and hereditary diseases wraps up with a boring conclusion that is too on the nose to make for great cinema. Wolfman begins with a short narrative prologue showing the film's protagonist, Blake Lovell, as a child, played by Christopher Abbott, later on in the film, on a hunting trip with his father 30 years before the events of the film proper. Even in this brief setup, the film shows its hand at what the major themes of Wolfman will be: overprotective parents. The next scene hits the point even harder as we jump 30 years into the future and see Blake with his young daughter, Ginger. The two walk hand in hand down a busy San Francisco street, giant toys and tutus in tow. Blake suffers from the same helicopter parenting as his father, taking his role as a protector a little too seriously. It's truthfully an interesting metaphor, but when the film is about men turning into wolves, the theme doesn't land as well. Behind this is the film's second but true theme: familial hereditary illness. Each father is trying to protect their children from something greater, but in the end, the threat is themselves. Again, it's an interesting idea. It's just the execution that fails to realize this theme. Julia Garner is also in this film. She plays Charlotte, Blake's workaholic wife. Her performance here is actually one of the worst technical aspects of the film, though I don't know if that is entirely her fault. It feels like most of her direction was just to make a concerned look slightly to the left of the camera. Garner has proven her acting skills, but she just simply isn't given enough to do in Wolfman. She begins the film as this stereotypical overstressed wife and mom, before quickly turning into a loving mother and doting wife when the script demands it. Her lack of development and meaningful dialogue is par for the course for the rest of the film's problems. Garner's Charlotte is only one of many underdeveloped parts of Wolfman. The relationship between Blake and his father is painfully thin, and this is made all the worse by a third act twist the film practically telegraphs to the audience beforehand. Narratively, the film suffers greatly. Nothing lands or feels meaningful when we are digging into metaphors of family and hereditary trauma. Wolfman, though, is a much better film when we lose these themes and focus on the man becoming the monster. After a fantastically shot crash sequence, Blake begins his metamorphosis into the titular Wolfman. This scene in particular, the car crash scene, is riveting and it ratchets up the tension and horror. Winnell and his crew are doing some truly unique things in Wolfman with lighting, sound production, and perspective changes. When Blake begins to change, the lighting in the scene changes as well. Everything around him goes dark and he's left by himself under one spotlight. It looks great on screen and has a unique way to frame Blake's separation from his family and his old life. The sound production in particular I found truly remarkable. A scene where Blake begins to hear a spider crawling on the wall, and the sound mixing in the crash sequence is some of the best productions I've heard in recent years. His change is captured in such a unique way, with the color palettes, sound, and surroundings changing around him as the camera perspective shifts. It's the best part of the film, and it makes the second act the most compelling part of Wolfman. Werewolf films, especially those centered on a human changing into one, often utilize copious amounts of body horror to varying degrees of success. Wolfman also utilizes body horror, but in a way that is much more terrifying and more believable. The prosthetics Abbott wears towards the end of the film aren't the best, but the moments of sickness leading up to his change are what truly stand out. It's just a shame everyone around him is less in awe of this transformation than we, the audience, are. Julia Garner is given little to say or do in these scenes, and his daughter is similarly underutilized. Rather than create a cohesive plan or panic in terror, they're more or less just dumbfounded by the transformation. It's hard to judge what a person would actually do in this improbable at best situation, but his family's reaction is far from believable. Wolfman ends in a way that is unsatisfying and underdeveloped. The themes of family trauma, helicopter parenting, and mental illness all come full circle, but it doesn't feel earned. Wolfman has a lot to say, but the film is actually at its best when it's not saying anything. The best horror movies are the ones that have something meaningful to say. 2024's sea of great releases proved that, from Late Night with the Devil to The Substance. But Wolfman falls into an odd category where the film would have been better if it didn't try so hard to be something it isn't. Monster movies and horror films are better when the themes are subtle and lie beneath the surface. We have the big monsters and the jump scares. Everything else should be subdued. The themes in Wolfman aren't subtle enough to hide below the surface, and they aren't realized well enough to make the audience think. In Wolfman, the man becomes the monster, and that's the only interesting part. If you like Wolfman or you want something similar, I have some recommendations. First, I'll give you two. The Mummy, the 2017 one with Tom Cruise, and Winnell's film before this, 2020's Invisible Man starring Elizabeth Moss. If you're not aware, Universal Studios plan to revitalize their entire monster movie universe into this MCU-style crossover of films called the Dark Universe. There's going to be a Dracula movie, a Wolfman movie, The Mummy, Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. It was a giant undertaking with huge stars like Johnny Depp and Russell Crowe signed on for multiple film deals. The series kicked off with 2017's The Mummy starring Tom Cruise, and the entire planned franchise collapsed after that film's disastrous financial disappointment. I find this whole saga one of the most interesting failures in all of Hollywood. Universal was banking so hard on this idea, but it was really just a terrible one. They essentially started with the end game. They said, how do we get an MCU style franchise under our banner? And then they just looked around at their properties and said, hey, we own all these old monster movies. Will that work? Audiences hated it from the jump, and the critics panned The Mummy. And while it certainly is not a very good movie, it's not all that bad. It's basically Mission Impossible 5 or 6, but with a mummy instead of whoever it is Ethan Hunt's fighting nowadays. Either way, it's a fun movie to revisit and the direct reason why we have this Blumhouse production of Wolfman. After the collapse of the Dark Universe, the script for a planned Invisible Man was canned until Blumhouse and Leigh Whannell picked it up. That film is actually quite good and one of the better classic monster movie reimaginings that has ever been done. Elizabeth Moss plays Cecilia Cass, a woman in an abusive relationship who finally finds the strength to end it, only to find her ex still stalking her by way of this advanced technology that makes him invisible. It's a great script, and the themes of abuse and strength to overcome work really well and are fully realized by the end of that film. Lastly, I would recommend just some classic Wolfman movies. The original 1941 film with Lou Chaney Jr. as the Wolfman is a great movie, and it's still very watchable today. Also, 1981 John Landis film An American Werewolf in London is one of the best werewolf movies ever made. It's this really interesting blend of horror comedy that shouldn't work, but it just kind of does. There's also Teen Wolf. That's the one where Michael J. Fox turns into a werewolf and plays basketball. It's not a fantastic film, but I do have a fond memory of sitting in a dive bar on my way home from work and watching that film in its entirety on TNT on an old tube TV in the corner of the bar. So it has a special place in my heart. Thank you guys so much for watching this week's Weekly Movie Minute. We're going to be back next week with Flight Risk, the new movie directed by Mel Gibson and starring Mark Wahlberg. Again, we are brought to you by create-context.com. A link is in the description.